Welcome to Tabletop Tommies. I'm Johnny.
And I'm Phil.
And today we're joined by a very special guest, author of the Stalingrad campaign book and the upcoming Case Blue campaign book. Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me on. Pleasure to join you today.
Real treat to have you on because obviously we're going to do an episode about this campaign book, but to actually get a look behind the curtain, as it were, and speak to the author is just a huge privilege. So thank you for being here again. My first question that I did want to ask you was, how did you get into wargaming originally? Because obviously you must be quite a seasoned wargamer now if you're involved in the actual rules writing.
Well, I think I entered the space through the same way that a lot of people do. Warhammer 40K, right? I think I saw a Games Workshop store and was mystified. What is this place? And so, of course, had to go in and take a look at the miniatures, and then, of course, the sticker shock of the prices. Poor little orphan me on the streets begging for change in order to buy a Space Marine. So got started there, and then I've always been interested in history. So it's a natural. Made the jump that a lot of people do from the fantasy and sci-fi to historicals. I think I started with Napoleonics, which is really diving in the deep end for historicals. But when Bolt Action came out, I'd been looking for a World War II rule set that I wanted to play, but there hadn't been one that had really caught my eye. And then when Bolt Action came out, I liked the fact that it had so much support behind it. In terms of models and community, and so I immediately jumped on that bandwagon when the version 1 came out, and been playing it ever since. I think I'm up to 8 or 9 armies now. Might gotta catch them all. I'm doing it Pokemon style, but it is my go-to rule set. Of course, as any self-respecting historical wargamer, I do have an entire closet full of other periods as well. But Bolt Action was kind of my first true love for historical wargaming, and so that's what kind of led me to investing so much effort into helping to add to that community.
And have you been involved since version 1, Alex, or did you jump on later on with Bolt Action?
No, my involvement began, it would have been around 2019, because I remember writing Stalingrad during the pandemic.
Okay.
And Warlord was looking for people to write articles for their website, kind of either scenarios or kind of historical backgrounds for certain kind of campaigns or battles. So I sent in a sample article. I think I wrote it about a one of the only Finnish armored attacks in the Winter War, where they sent their very, very early war tanks into the attack, and most of them got stuck in the snow or on a tree stump or something. And I guess they liked it because they asked me to write some more. I wrote about Japan invading the Aleutian Islands. And then from there, we started talking about campaign books, and we agreed that Stalingrad was, the kind of missing piece in the library of Bolt Action campaign books. So I started working on that, and then things have kind of gone from there.
So was it Warlord that suggested Stalingrad to you, rather than you going to them with an idea about the campaign book for Stalingrad?
Well, I had always had an interest in Stalingrad. For me, it's kind of the apocalyptic nature of it. The fact that so much destruction can be wrought in one place, and that it's not just the city but itself, but the city is kind of the iconic visual, right? The destroyed buildings, everything's kind of burnt out. It's like what hell on earth would look like, right? So the fact that I was like, humans can do this and fight over the same place for such a long time, and so many people can leave their lives for these, this destroyed city. So I had this kind of morbid fascination with Stalingrad, even as I was growing up and starting to consume all these history books. And then my kind of background, I'm a teacher, so I majored in history and English.
Okay.
And then I do teach history and English as well, middle school level. And so I've continued to hone my my writing skills and continue my historical research for my own personal use. Then when Warlord asked what kind of books I would be interested in, I immediately said, well, how about Stalingrad? And I'm like, oh, great, we were looking for someone to write about Stalingrad, so it was kind of fortuitous.
Interesting that both you and Warlord had the exact same idea at the same time. So when you get involved in a project like this, is it very much sort of you're left to it? Do they just hand you the baton and say, off you go, come back with a book? Or Do you have to do a lot of collaboration with sort of the studio staff and the rules staff to make sure that everything's in line?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting that there is a considerable amount of freedom in how
Hmm.
they let you construct your book. Basically we collaborated on an outline of, here's the kind of scope of the book, here's the
Mm-hmm.
length of the book, and here's what we want to include, kind of the major points, right? We want to capture this moment or this battle.
Hmm.
Beyond that, once we have an agreement on the overview, Warlord is very hands off. So they kind of left me to it, trusted that I would do my end. Every few months I'd check in, just make sure I was proceeding as on plan.
Hmm.
From my experience, the usually it's about a year from the initial kind of signing of contracts to the delivering the manuscript.
Yeah.
But I might only hear from them a few times during that year, just to check in with me. But I was a little, I kind of expected not to be necessarily micromanaged, but to have them, say, hey, we want to make sure we're including this unit because we're going to have a plastic kit coming out, blah blah blah.
Mm.
There's really none of that. It's more of just you write the book as you like, and show us it when you're done, and then of course you go through the editing process, and some
Yeah.
things get changed there. But early in Stalingrad, I had to get in touch with them and make some adjustments because the original scope I had set out included a lot of the material that now is in Case Blue, kind of
Hmm.
the things on the periphery, right? Including the Italians, the Hungarians, the Romanians.
Mm.
And I quickly realized there was just not enough space in this book for everything and to do justice to what's going on in Stalingrad itself.
Sure.
So, I said, hey, look, I feel like I'm going to be stretched too thin if I try to do all of this.
Hmm.
How would you feel about just zooming in on, the Stalingrad itself and the immediate, surroundings? And they were very supportive. They said, "Yes, sounds great. Do what you think is best." And I was like, "Okay." So I just went from there. And that material has now a lot of it has made its way into Case Blue, which I mean,
Yeah.
part of the reason that I wanted to do Case Blue is I felt like I had something of unfinished business
Hmm.
with that. Some people were, "Hey, where are the Italians?" And I was like, I know, I wanted to include them, but we would have been leaving out some of this other great material. So there's so much packed in this little, not little area, but this area of the, Eastern Front that
Mm.
it's, I mean, I think Stronger had like 20 scenarios and so does Case Blue. So they're
Hmm.
thick books. And I wanted to do justice to both, and that really required two books in order to do that.
So, picking up on the scenarios, Alex, is that something that, as the author, you're responsible for in terms of designing them, playtesting them, and then delivering the goods at the end of that process? Or are there other people involved from Warlords stepping in when you have handed over the manuscript to fine tune and tweak those scenarios?
Yeah, so the initial draft, the initial manuscript is pretty much all me. I did
Hmm.
have a research assistant in Stalingrad, a German gentleman who helped me with some of the translations because I try to use primary sources whenever possible.
Yeah.
Not all of them have been translated into English, and my German is very shaky.
Hmm.
I know what a Flammenwerfer is and a Nebelwerfer,
Yeah.
things that throw. I know that, but some of the other terms escape me, right? So having someone who spoke fluent German was very useful. I had to source my own Russian speakers to translate some of the Russian.
Hmm.
But the good thing about writing Stalingrad and Case Blue when I did is a lot of the archives that were not available before the fall of the Soviet Union
Mm.
are now open, right? So there's this
Mm.
flood of new books coming out about the Eastern Front
Hmm.
that weren't available, 20, 30 years ago. And some of these are, have come out in just in the last few years,
Hmm.
really combing these archives for fresh takes. And one thing I did want to capture especially in Stalingrad, was this kind of more balanced perspective of what the battle was like for both the Germans, Soviets, and the kind of minor Axis, right?
Mm.
Because the history up until that point had really been written by the Germans. We had the German accounts of this whole campaign. We didn't have a lot of, translations into English, at least from their allies. And the Soviet side was the official line only, right? The propaganda that had been approved to go out, but not
Mm.
necessarily the unfiltered accounts. So things like their daily war diaries that the various armies kept, including Chukov in Stalingrad, those are now available, and they're very interesting to read to see how the commanders were feeling on a day-to-day basis about their position and about the battle. So I combed through a lot of that when I could. And so I kind of wanted to give the Soviets a fair shake and give them some agency in
Mm-hmm.
Stalingrad. And I
Mm-hmm.
hope that I accomplished that. And then in Case Blue, I definitely wanted to get sources that were not just German, right? So
Mm.
I found a decent amount of Italian sources. Romanian, Hungarian were much more difficult, but I did what I could
Mm-hmm.
to see what they thought about their, the battles they fought, the campaign, the their kind of take on the entire crusade, right, as they call it, to the east. Not all of them were particularly enthusiastic about being sent into the vast Russian steppe,
Mm-hmm.
especially the Italians, I think, were like, what are we doing here? So it was very interesting to get their point of view and try to,
Mm.
to piece it all together.
In your original research, was there anything that came up that was completely new to you that you'd not seen in any of the histories previously?
So, well, I mean, for both Stalingrad and Case Blue, there was a lot of new information for me.
Mm-hmm.
I had done the research, but again, most of the books I had read were written in, the 60s, 70s, 80s,
Mm.
when I had originally kind of become fascinated with this topic.
Mm-hmm.
And they presented a certain point of view based on the research or the what they had available, right?
Yeah.
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 These
Yeah.
are these are considered kind of the foundational books about the battle and about the campaign.
Mm-hmm.
So reading especially firsthand accounts from soldiers, Red Army soldiers that were in Stalingrad,
Mm.
very interesting. They are completely transparent about how desperate it is,
Mm-hmm.
but the level of backbone they have about the whole thing is very well, is the transformation, right, of the Red Army, because prior to Stalingrad, it had basically been a unending series of defeats, and then they get to Stalingrad, and suddenly they just decide like this is it. We're not
Yeah.
going east any further. We're going west from this point on,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and this kind of infuses the entire force in Stalingrad. And you have new units coming in, and they're kneeling on the banks of the Volga to pledge to the flag that they won't retreat,
Mm-hmm.
and it becomes almost this like cult-like obsession with the Red Army to like hold the Germans here. And
Mm.
so reading the firsthand accounts of soldiers like squatting in a burned out building, roasting a rat over a fire, and but still confident that they're going to somehow repel the Germans with
Mm-hmm.
their, 8 rounds of rifle rounds left and one Molotov cocktail, but they're still determined to make it happen anyway. It's very interesting to see the psychological aspect of that, and then to also read the Germans, who are just increasingly frustrated and baffled by the sudden fanaticism from their enemy that they hadn't
Mm-hmm.
experienced before. Like, why aren't they running away? Why aren't they surrendering?
Yeah.
Why are they
Yeah.
fighting to the last man? And just becoming more and more fatalistic. And
Okay.
basically, you have German officers telling newcomers, like a new unit will get cycled in, and they're like, don't really worry about trying to take your objective. It's not going to happen. Just try to save as many of your men as possible. And so this kind of we think of the Germans as these like almost robotic, efficient soldiers who are do their duty no matter what. But they are affected by this apocalyptic setting just as much as everyone
Mm.
else, and it quickly sets a fatalistic viewpoint into most of them, and they're most of them think this is where I'll die. There's no escape,
Mm.
right? And while the Russians think this is where I'll die as well, they think of it in almost more positive, like, yes, here's where I'll die, and we'll defeat the Germans here. While the
Mm-hmm.
Germans are like, this is where we'll die, and we'll never get the Russians out of this city. So it was very interesting learning the psychological aspects of the people involved. And then when it got to Case Blue, definitely wanted to get the viewpoints of the soldiers, especially in the Axis miners. I did a lot of research into the Italians, especially. There's a
Mm-hmm.
great book by Eugene. It's his last name's Cordo. He was an Alpini soldier, and he was with the retreat. He described the entire journey, and it's the most harrowing expedition you can ever imagine. And along the way, he's giving his judgments about this entire campaign, about his allies, the Germans, who he despises, the Russian soldiers, the Russian kind of peasantry, and the people living there. And it's like a man transported to a world that's completely foreign to him. It's almost like a Alice in Wonderland nightmare version of
Mm.
this, different terrain, different people, different everything, and to see what it's like from someone who just feels like he doesn't belong here, right? He's what? Why am I here? How did this all come to this, right? But determined to do his duty anyway, and you get his unfiltered, uncensored take on the entire campaign. And so
Mm.
those are the kind of things I found very valuable. course, not always completely applicable to bolt action, but I feel like it's important to understand these armies. In order to do that, you need to understand the soldiers. And at bolt action, you're talking about platoon level, right? And so individual heroics, individual soldiers do matter. This isn't battalion level where the individual becomes just a statistic, right? We've all had that single man who's somehow saved the day, right? And
Yeah.
taken out a tank or sniped the opponent's lieutenant to get that victory point at the last moment or whatever. So, the individuals do matter, and I try to discover like what they felt and how they fought and their opinions and their experiences. And so, firsthand accounts are always best for that, primary accounts. And so I did as much research into that as possible, and also just to find out how they actually fought, right? Because what's the best source of how soldiers fought is the soldiers themselves, right? What's in the official database of what a unit is equipped with doesn't necessarily always match up with what the soldiers have on the ground. And
Sure.
oh yeah, we have all these anti-tank guns. Where are they? We didn't have any of those. So you get it. You need to kind of look at it from both angles.
What I find really interesting is how you move from doing the historical research, and you mentioned a lot about the first-hand accounts and reading it from the Soviets, from the Italians, Hungarians, etc., to then translating that into a game, and in terms of game mechanics, game design, rules for particular units, and so on. What's involved in that process?
Well, my kind of philosophy is to find, at least when I'm designing new units, scenarios, what's unique, what's kind of out of the ordinary, right? Because I think we all have an idea of what a kind of, I don't know, vanilla World War II battle would be, right? And we've all played plenty of those. But when we're looking for new scenarios, especially, what is out of the ordinary here? What's interesting here that would make you want to play this rather than one of the generic scenarios in the rule book, right? Or whatever, or a tournament style kind of symmetrical battle. So, especially in Case Blue, I think the scenarios are pretty diverse. Some of them are pretty wild, I'm going to be honest. There are things that make an appearance that are fairly new, including a Soviet light cruiser that pulls up to a dock and opens fire. And if players are crazy enough to represent that with an actual model, they're welcome to do so. There are airborne landings, there are amphibious attacks, there are last stands, desperate charges, you name it. So I looked for the moments that are not the kind of standard symmetrical two forces battling over a farmhouse kind of battles, but the things that are kind of iconic, right? And include those. And the same thing kind of goes for the units. Like, what is different about this unit that would justify it becoming its own unit? Or this, right? So this is something that bolt action, I think, has a little bit of a problem with, the kind of duplicate units. I think, there has been a call from the community to kind of rationalize the units a little bit, maybe merge a few together. So, I'm looking at two things. What are certain armies missing in terms of their roster that might be important for players to have in terms of tools, their disposal, or just maybe units that are kind of iconically, Italian or iconically Romanian, and they're not being included is making the army a little bit ahistorical. But also, what are units that are unique enough that they would have their own rules of some kind, right? Their own equipment or their own style of fighting, and trying to get those in there so that people can mix it up, right? Build a few new units, add it to their army, play a little bit differently. If it's just another kind of copy with a slightly different uniform or something, it might not justify becoming its own unit.
Yeah, that's one of the things I noticed looking through the review copy that we received, that each of the nations you haven't really done a whole list of hundreds of entries for them, but all the ones you've done are unique generally. I can't recall any of the ones where I just looked at them and thought, well, that's just a rifle squad, really. Nearly every single one has sort of a unique thing, like the Viking SS squad, where it's not just a normal SS squad, it's got a special rule unique to that. And I thought it was a really nice touch that actually we don't need to have the same unit over and over with a different name. But it's really nice when you've got something that's got a little bit of a tweak to it, especially if it's sort of like So with that one, where you've sort of you're getting an extra special rule, but at the cost of your normal German rule for your NCO, that's a really interesting little way to do it.
Yeah, and I'm of the opinion that we don't necessarily need, right, every single formation to have its own unit. But there are units that are different enough, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
Viking XS are a good example of that, where they are unique, right? They're
Mm.
mostly made up of non-Germans. They're
Hmm.
a lot of Finnish soldiers, and other kind of Scandinavians, and they fought differently, and they didn't consider themselves part of the. They considered themselves, Finnish fighting in the German army, but not a member necessarily of that army. So
Hmm.
they were almost like on loan,
Yeah.
which really is the case because they eventually went back, I believe, to Finland. So they kind of resisted the Germanization of their unit to a certain extent. They're like, "Oh, we know what we're doing. We've fought the Soviets before. We'll just do it our way. Don't worry about it." So you get a unique experience by taking that squad, right? So that's yeah. I've looked for opportunities to do that, give people something new to add to their army that's going to provide a different feel, different flavor.
Mm.
Of course, we all like a nice uniform and something that's going to be a little different than something else. But I think in terms of gameplay, it's important also to find what is unique about this unit that would justify it having its own entry. Because
Hmm.
let's be honest, the German unit list, I think it's over 250 units at
Hmm.
this
Hmm.
point. So
Probably, yeah.
especially for the Germans, I got to be very like, okay, does this justify adding to this enormous, overwhelming list?
Hmm.
If not, then maybe it can be folded into an existing thing. But
Mm.
there still are some nice treats for the Germans here, although the minor axes probably get the more you get more for their money in this. They get
Yeah.
more units, but I think every nation gets at least four or five new units. So there's
Mm-hmm.
something for everybody here. If you're
Oh,
fighting on the Eastern
absolutely.
Front, I think that you're not going to be left completely out in the cold.
Oh, no,
Hmm.
absolutely. I think the big winners are the Italians in this one, from my perspective, because the new national characteristics you gave them I presume those national characteristics are mainly to be used with the theatre selectors found in the book rather than as an overall replacement. But those ones there are very nicely done. I don't think there's a single one that will annoy you by making your army worse.
Yeah. So, I play Italians. I also play Hungarians, and I'm
Hmm.
just starting my Romanians. Like I said, I'm trying to collect them all. Um, and I'm, to be honest, haven't been a fan of the Italian special rules. And
Yeah.
my philosophy is that, of course, every army has its pros and cons. It's things that it's good at, things that it's not so good at. But most nations don't have any national rules that can provide a malice or a negative, right?
Hmm.
The Italians do, and so I kind of use the Japanese as an example of a philosophy where you can turn something that maybe isn't necessarily uh, such a great idea, but is unique and spin it to a positive. So let me explain what I mean. So, the bonsai charge that the Japanese have. Okay.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Historically, was it the most effective strategy? Well, not later in the war, right? It was that led to them getting mowed down. But it's such an iconic Japanese tactic that you got to include it, and it's spun into a positive. You can make this automatic move towards your enemy. Is it a good idea tactically? Maybe, maybe not. That's up to you, the player. But they
Hmm.
they don't give you any sort of inherent penalty in doing it. They leave it up to you. Okay, here's this tactic the Japanese use. You can choose to employ it or not. We're going to give you this ability, and you can use it for good or ill. But there's no essential negative behind it. There's no like penalties, anything like that. You
Hmm.
decide how you use it, and we'll see from there. So, when I looked at things like the Italians, Hungarians, Romanians, I looked at, okay, well, what was unique about their fighting style, right?
Hmm.
And things that, weren't necessarily what you consider positives can still be spun into something that's interesting. And I'll give a kind of vague example because I don't want to give it too much away about the book. But the resourcefulness of these soldiers who had the secondhand equipment or no equipment at all to defeat superior enemy forces was something that I thought deserved recognition, right? So
Mm.
um, these soldiers who have very little in terms of equipment can still manage to fight hard using ingenuity and kind of grit, right? And so you can take that, okay, you can take that one of two ways. You take it negative way, oh, they don't have any good equipment, so we'll give them a negative. Or, well, they didn't have that much good equipment, but they did the best with what they could, and they were determined enough to find ways around that. Let's see how we can make that into some sort of bonus for them or positive for them that would be fun for the player. So, that was kind of my design philosophy around the Army Special Rules. They are designed for the scenarios in the book. That being said, I did manage to squeeze in the provision that if your opponent agrees to you using those special rules, that they are allowed outside the book. Same goes with tournament organizers. I have no idea how that's going to shake out, if they're going to get banned at tournaments or not. I guess it'll depend on how balanced or not they are determined once it gets out into the wider playtesting world. I would be excited to see them kind of promulgate everywhere and become popular, but if they are just used in the book, that's fine too. It'll be up to individuals. I think, in friendly games, I expect to see them used with some regularity. Tournaments are of course a whole different matter, and balance isn't of course an issue. But I tried to give Italian, Hungarian, Romanian players something that they would be excited for and want to use in other areas. Now, I will say that if you are not taking an Eastern Front army, these rules might not be necessarily accurate. So, for instance, an Italian force fighting in North Africa, these sets of rules would faction rules would not necessarily be appropriate. And so, if you were trying to use those, I would be a little suspicious of you trying to gain an advantage. But I wrote these for the Eastern Front, and for the Hungarians, Romanians, that's primarily where they fought. Kind of makes sense for them in general. For the Italians, they fought on many different theaters, so they may or may not be appropriate depending on where you're fighting. So I've kind of left that door open for players to make the decision on where they want to use them outside of the book.
Yeah, okay. I can totally see tournaments like the Welsh Open, English Open that we have in the UK, where basically it's historically accurate platoons or as close as possible to sort of thematic platoons. I can see those sort of tournament organisers totally allowing, if you're using the selector from the book, definitely use the national characteristics from the book because that's what fits your theme. But as you say, if it's sort of a generic platoon, then I imagine TOs will probably be a bit more wary because you're not really sure how those rules are going to interact with each other. But none of them seem ridiculous, in my opinion. All the national characteristics for all the nations in the book seem sort of nice perks. And as you say, there are a lot of the sort of the choices where if you take the big Italian squads, you get a bit of a perk. But obviously, you've had to take big squads to do that, which are expensive. So it's nice that players have that sort of decision during the army building to think about it.
Can I just jump in just very quickly about tournament play, but it's to do with the magic sentence and can be taken in a generic reinforced platoon. Is that something, Alex, that you decide as the author of the book, or is that something that gets added later by the design studio at Warlord?
So initially it's kind of my call, and I craft the verbiage that goes onto each unit. However, in particular, the units get a kind of extra layer of scrutiny by Warlord, and Alessio takes a look at them too. So, for example, my initial version of some units, and I think this is something we're going to come to when we talk about the now infamous Italian cavalry squad. They can get some edits, some tweaks from Alessio and from Warlord about how they fit into the existing kind of roster and what abilities they have and when and where they'll be allowed to be taken. In general, I'm a fan of allowing units to be placed into generic platoons unless there's something that is so strange or unique to a certain kind of point in time that they wouldn't make sense to. Like for instance, stragglers are a unit in this book, right? Which are just the kind of frozen, half-dead soldiers escaping from encirclement, and they are horrible in every sense. They're like the least effective soldiers in the world, but they're extremely cheap. Do those make sense in a generic platoon? Would a Panzer Grenadier division storming across the the French planes in
Hmm.
1940 have a horde of straggler units? No. So those are some, not included, right? So I tried to be selective about what would be, you know, wouldn't make sense in a kind of standard platoon.
But yeah.
But for the
Hmm.
most part, I uh, kind of defaulted to allowing things in the generic platoon
Hmm.
if it, unless it didn't make sense.
Is whenever there's a new campaign book, there's always a big scramble to look at the new units and which ones you can take in a generic platoon. And if I don't know how many campaign books there are. It's getting on to 20, if not over 20. And there are some campaign books where none of the new units are legal in a generic platoon. And there are others, we were talking about Tough Gut in the recent episode, where near enough every one is legal in a generic platoon. So it's really interesting from a community perspective what gets in, and does that fall down to the designer, to the design studio, to Alessio, and to others, and so on.
Well, yeah, and I think at some point, I'm not entirely sure of what happened, but I think at some point there was some sort of decision made by Warlord about basically what units were legal where.
Mm. Hmm.
And so some books that predated that decision might not have the right verbiage
Hmm.
because it wasn't taken into consideration, right?
Yeah.
And I think, for instance, when I wrote Stalingrad, I think this that the and I can't remember when this happened, but I think that kind of shift in um, kind of what was legal and not happened right around it when it came out.
Mm.
And so I'm trying to remember, this was a few years ago now, but I seem to remember thinking, oh, did I really shoot myself in the foot based, with how I wrote the verbiage for these units? Is it accurate to this new ruling? And I can't remember if I think for the most part, most of the units that are in that book are allowed.
Hmm.
But it's something that can be a little tough for people who are writing the books.
Mm.
We're independent contractors. We're not employees
Hmm.
of Warlord.
Hmm.
Um, and what we have access to in terms of knowledge of upcoming decisions, units, plans is very, very limited, right?
Mm.
So, for instance, I was writing Case Blue simultaneously with the gentleman who was writing Tough Gut, and I have, no idea what he's doing, and I assume he has no idea what I'm doing.
Okay.
And the same thing happened with Stalingrad and Soft Underbelly, right? So I
Mm.
think at one point we had almost like duplicate units. I think they were we both had our own version of Panzer Grenadiers, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and so we're off kind of in our own little worlds, and we're not necessarily kept in the loop of what's happening in terms of the wider plans that Warlord has. So when things don't always align properly, it's just sometimes out of the control of the authors.
Hmm.
And the same goes for whether or not something is in a campaign book, right? So
Mm.
I try to be engaged with the community on Facebook and Bolt Action and other places. And you see questions like, "Oh, Warlord, why didn't you include this in this unit?" Well,
Hmm.
the author didn't include that, and there might be a bunch of reasons for that, space, time, whatever, or the constraints of the book. The author is pretty much crafting this by themselves.
Hmm.
It's one person, not their day job, right? For instance,
Mm.
I'm a teacher,
Hmm.
9 to 5, and I work on the books at night, doing all the research, doing all the play testing, doing all the writing by themselves. So, I think maybe people don't realize that they see Warlord as this corporate entity. And I think a lot of them kind of conflate it with Games Workshop in terms of resources, and I don't think they're really comparable.
Hmm.
Warlord, from what my experience working with them, is much smaller, and their resources are more limited. And
Mm.
so, I think people see, well, why didn't I get everything I wanted from Warlord? Well, there can be a lot of reasons for that. And to blame Warlord for this or that, I think sometimes is a misunderstanding of how they operate and what their kind of capabilities are in terms of putting out new units and
Mm.
I mean, let's look at the campaign books I put out, right? There are all these new units. Are they going to be able to produce kits for all of them? No, it's not feasible, right? Their
Hmm.
production capabilities are, even if they would sell, which some of these, let's be honest, some of these aren't going to be profitable units that are going to fly off the shelves. No one's lining up for stragglers, I would imagine.
Hmm.
Um, uh, the capability is just not there, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they have to be strategic about which kits they put out, which books they put out, what is included, what isn't. And so
Hmm.
not everyone is always going to get everything they want. We the authors of these campaigns do our best, but we're all just single authors working to complete these kind of on our own, with a little bit of help with research and whatnot. But for the most part, we are a one-man team. So just, maybe for anyone listening out there, if you're upset you didn't get what you wanted out of a campaign book, well, I'm sorry. We're doing our best.
Yeah. We had a very similar conversation on our episode when we reported back after the Warlords Open Day. Johnny and I went to Warlord HQ earlier on, well, last month now, early September, and we were talking on the pod about how the perception, it seems, from some people in the community is that Warlord is this big entity and it has this big design team, and the new releases in terms of the rules and the units and the campaign books are working closely alongside the new miniature sculpts and the new releases and so on. But it's just not the case in exactly the way that you've just mentioned. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, their ability to in fact, it's almost come to the point where the campaign books have kind of outstripped a lot of their, I guess, industrial capacity, if you want to say. There's, I think, not to, kind of speculate about their business, but they have to keep new content coming out with Bolt Action to keep it alive and keep people interested. But how many kits can they put out a year? Maybe half dozen, right? So they have to be very selective about what gets a kit and what doesn't, right? And so not everything is going to be able to get a kit, and they don't want to shackle the authors with these kind of limitations. Like, okay, well, we're only going to be able to put out this, this, and this. So don't be creating units that we can't put out. So there's this kind of fine balance of wanting to allow the authors to write books that are true to what they want to write about and not to micromanage them, and also the business side of it. So, I for one really appreciate the freedom that Warlord has given me in writing these books, and not to micromanage me and say that you must have this or you can't have that. But it does create sometimes these. I think it's just important for people to understand that how the process works, right? And so that they can manage their expectations. Like you said, they're not Games Workshop. So what can they do? Well, they're doing what they can, So I'm sure they would love to put out twice as many kits and twice as many units and twice as many campaign books. But I think they're already operating pretty much at capacity of what, as they are now.
Yeah.
So, being patient, I think is the key here, right? When Stalingrad came out, the Italians didn't get there doing this, Place in the Sun. Now they are. It took a couple years, but they're getting to these places. It's just going to take a bit because they can't just pump out a new edition and I think that goes for the third edition too, right? I think everyone's a little is about ready for third edition Bolt Action. I know I would like to see one, but it's going to be a little bit, right? Because that's a big undertaking. I mean, I think people don't really necessarily think about what would that mean in terms of their kind of all their supplements, right? Well, okay, you say you change the point costs of this and that, you've now basically invalidated all of these books, these supplements, all the armor books, all the campaign books. Do you reprint them? Do you or are they just now no longer valid? Or do you put out a online FAQ and people have to reference that to find the changes? It's more than just putting out a new rule book. It's like redoing their whole network of supplements too.
Yeah, the whole back catalog. Yeah, on the note actually with the models, I think because it's World War II and it's not like sort of your Warhammer 40k where the units are specific sort of fictional units, there's often a kit available from another manufacturer, or you get sort of like kit bashing, stuff like that. And I think Warlord have always been sort of quite comfortable with the fact that other models do exist. It would be great if you bought ours, but there are other World War II models available. And as you've already brought it up there, the Italian cavalry, which got a bit of a shout out in one of the early Case Blue articles, that I don't think I had a little look and I couldn't see any Italian cavalry models anywhere really. Have you got any pro tips for kit bashing them? Because I think they'll be quite popular.
Yeah, I would imagine. So it's interesting. I think that little preview must have caught some people's imagination. I have actually seen several 3D printing studios putting out models
Yeah.
for printing. So I imagine if you have a 3D printer, that might be one option to go. If you have, or you can, I'm sure they'll sell physical prints as well. Um, I'm kit batching mine using the Warlord. Well, I'm making my dismounted version using the Warlord Italians, and I'm basically green stuffing over their feet to make
Hmm.
Hmm.
cavalry boots, and then there is a little kind of bandolier attachment that you can add to them that will kind of get that look. And then you want to use the carbons, right, rather than
Yeah.
the full length rifles. So there are some abilities to kit bash the cavalry. Of course, the mounted troops are a little trickier. I know a lot of people like to use Perry
Hmm.
American
Yep.
Yep.
Civil War cavalry and kind of chop them up off at the waist, right, and then attach
Yep.
a
I've done that
upper
before.
torso.
Likewise.
Yeah, I think I have a box specifically earmarked for
Hmm.
dismemberment somewhere in my uh, pile of shame. So there are some abilities. I can't say for sure what Warlord is planning on in terms of model releases.
Hmm.
That's not something that
Hmm.
they share with me. But I wouldn't be too surprised if that becomes something they put out based on the kind of interest
Mm.
that seems to have cropped up around it. I will say that when people ask me
Hmm.
about that unit, I don't have a lot of information because that is one of those units that Alessio must have taken a personal interest in.
Ah.
They were very different in my version. Yeah. They were good, but they've definitely been taken up a
Yeah,
whole
yeah.
extra level since I
Interesting.
last.
Oh, really? Because that was one of the ones I was going to ask you about the intention behind, because that they get to charge twice. But yours was slightly different, was it originally?
Yeah, well, I mean, I had been kind of interested in this, this kind of anachronistic cavalry charge, right? That seemed
Hmm.
completely out of place in a World War II
Mm-hmm.
setting. But I think it's captured some other people's imagination as well because it's one of those, like I said, iconic moments of this
Hmm.
campaign, right? Of a kind of this almost like noble 19th century kind of charge that is just completely had been basically disconnected. In fact, the Germans even commented this isn't something that we do anymore.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing to the Italian commanders? Despite the fact that it was successful, they were just astonished that their first thought was, well, let's charge. So I think they wanted to capture that kind of impetuous and nature of these
Hmm.
cavalrymen, these proud Italian cavalrymen who are willing to head into battle, sabers drawn. And so, it's an interesting unit. I think it's going to be a kind of potentially a staple unit, at least in
Hmm.
Eastern Front armies.
Hmm.
But I think, with the Italian special rules that they're going to get in the supplement and the new units, I think we're going to see a wide variety of Italian armies
Hmm.
coming out in at least Eastern Front themed armies coming out because I try to build some flexibility. And the Italian forces were fairly diverse. You had Alpini, you had the black shirts, you had the regular soldiers, you had these cavalrymen, you had the Bersaglieri,
Hmm.
and so you can really build a lot of diverse forces here. And I wanted to give players some options to theme their force to different kind of types of troops or different types
Hmm.
of strategies. And so I expect there'll be some pretty interesting Italian forces coming out, and I'm looking forward to seeing what people
Hmm.
cobble together once the book is released.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, on the note of cavalry, I also collect Hungarians, and the Hungarians get some more cavalry in here, but they still have the same sort of no charging in rule. Is that one that again was sort of outside of your hands, or is that one that you retained yourself?
Yeah, so I know that is a sticking point with a lot of people.
Mm,
There's the issue of historical accuracy, and the reality is there are not a lot of sources for Romanian Hungarian cavalry fighting in close quarters. But it was a need to align with the rulings that Warlord made regarding cavalry, both in
yeah.
the FAQ and in other books, and not to necessarily supplant them. So there was kind of a joint decision there. I know some people will be disappointed. My goal with these units was to provide them with a viable alternative to charging into melee. And to do
Hmm.
that, I have beefed up essentially their firepower, right? So these cavalry squads can take machine guns now. They can take submachine guns, so that when they do dismount, they are a formidable, infantry squad that can lay down some serious firepower. So hopefully that takes the sting off it a little bit, and to think of them
Hmm.
more as mounted infantry rather than
Hmm.
cavalry. Maybe it requires a bit of a expectation shift, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I expect that's something that's going to be a little controversial, but it was necessary in order to maintain the kind of thread that had been kind of laid down previously, and how these units were to be handled.
Yeah. That's reading through it. I was rather hoping with them having that sort of negative rule, they'd also sort of get a slight points reduction. But of course, if they're the same as the ones in the Armies of Axis book, but slightly cheaper, you've kind of made the one in the Axis book sort of invalid. No one's ever going to take it again. So I do see how you sort of we're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place with these cavalry, I think.
Well, yeah, and as the campaign books come out, it becomes more and more tricky to navigate the existing kind of lore or whatever you want to call it of the other books, right?
Yeah.
I kind of think of it like, I don't
Hmm.
know if you guys remember Star Wars before
Hmm.
the
Yeah, yeah,
prequels and all that, when the
Yeah.
extended universe, and there was like a million Star Wars books, and they were like contradicted each other, and they barely had a coherent kind of
yeah. Hmm.
framework. It's almost become like that, where you're like you almost need like a lore master to, okay, what was canon and what was not canon, and what, okay, that's going to contradict that. Okay. So to have to kind of try to not invalidate previous units, and to contradict previous expansions and whatnot, it is a little tricky. I will say that the Hungarians, and I believe the Romanians as well, they do get some special love in their rules for their
Hmm.
Hmm.
horse-mounted troops. So maybe that will take the sting off a little bit. So when you get the book,
Mm.
you can take a look at that and see if maybe that assuages your um, depression over the lack of being able to charge into melee.
Yeah. So in here we've got the anti-tank rifle squad for the Soviets, where you can have multiple anti-tank rifles in one squad, which is brilliant. I'm very excited for this unit. And my question about sort of the intention behind it is, with these squads, we often see sort of 3 men can have this or 2 men can have this, and it doesn't sort of separate the NCO from the pack. So, like with the LMG squad, sometimes you'll have sort of 4 men, and they can have 2 LMGs, and then the question is, can the NCO be either the machine gunner or the loader? And so, my question, sort of, with the intention around there, is that the case with the anti-tank rifle squad? Can the NCO be either the loader or the anti-tank rifleman?
I I don't see why not.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I can see in the rules, that's not disallowed.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's a good idea or not is up for the individual players to decide. So, if you do give your NCO a light machine gun, then in the case of a sniper or exceptional damage, I think that becomes the obvious man to kill,
Yeah,
rather than the
absolutely.
NCO or the light machine gun guy. Okay, which one do I take? You're kind of putting all your eggs in one
Mm-hmm.
basket there. But, at least for the Soviets, the formality of command structure at the very lowest levels was a lot. Was a lot. An NCO would very much be lugging around whatever they wanted, right? If they
Mm.
wanted the anti-tank rifle, or maybe they like, oh, I'm the best shot in this squad, I'll take it. So I can see, you can. I don't see why you wouldn't be able to. Warlord, I'm sure, will give an official ruling on that if it becomes a
Hmm.
point of contention. They do consult me on the FAQ regards to my
Okay.
books, but
Mm-hmm.
the general FAQs that are kind of more universal, and for the other books, of course, I'm not
Hmm.
involved in. So, um, it
Yeah.
I think the managing of the FAQs, like I said, has become part of that lore master job of okay,
Yeah.
well, this book says this and that book says that, so which is the ruling? And like I said, that came up
Mm-hmm.
in the soft underbelly in Stalingrad book, where there was two versions of Panzer Grenadiers that were priced slightly differently, and so Warlord had to come in and make a ruling on that. Okay, well, which one
Hmm.
is right, or which one should be canon, I guess. Um,
Yeah.
and so it's a little, it's tricky. It's a tangled web at this point. My personal opinion is I don't see why you couldn't do something like that if you're so inclined.
Yeah. That's how the rules seems to be written for me. The Mariana and Palau book has a similar thing with the flamethrower squad of sort of 4 men. You get a BAR, you get a flamethrower team, and 1 rifleman. But it just says what the men have. And it's very much rules as written, well, the NCO can be any of these men, which makes sense to me, that he just sort of acquisitions the best kit for himself. But because we've gotten so used to the book saying the NCO can have this and the men can have this, it sometimes is a bit of a... It's sort of one of those ones that I think probably will come up in an FAQ in the future.
Yeah, and well, I mean, I haven't seen anything from Warlord specifying that the NCO needs to be kind of aloof from the operations of the squad, but maybe that
Yeah.
there was an intention there that I've missed. So for me, it's not something I really worried about when I was creating my units. In certain cases, there are kind of rules and regulations that I came across in terms of the armament of such and such soldier. Like the NCO gets an SMG. That's like written down. They wrote it in their order of battle, and it seems to have been the case when I read the primary accounts. And in those cases, I specify what the NCO gets. But in other cases, it's just like, yeah, we went into battle and we just had whatever we had. And if that's the case, I kind of leave it up to the players.
Brilliant.
I've got...
Go ahead.
Go on, Johnny.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I'm really liking as well that you've thrown in a Hungarian and Romanian flamethrower team. But I realised it wasn't a question. It was just something that I really liked. And so I stopped myself.
That's okay. Yeah, they were missing, right? That was the kind of there's a hole there and like I said, I read the community and there's that comes up quite frequently. So where's our flamethrower? I'm like, all right, I'm gonna give you what you want here. The other thing that has come up a bunch of times, which I'll go ahead and address here in case anyone's reading this, is the Romanian anti-tank rifles. Controversy is much too strong a word, but there is a small but vocal group that are very pro Romanian getting anti-tank rifles, and I've engaged with them a few times. So, did Romania have anti-tank rifles? As far as I can tell, yes, they purchased them, but I could find no record of them being deployed on the Eastern Front. So, there is no Romanian anti-tank rifle team in this book. So, if that was what your hint, putting your hopes on, or going to be your deciding factor in whether or not to purchase this book, just want to warn you up front. If it's not in there, there's no. So sorry, folks.
But unless I'm very much mistaken, on the other note, before you just turn the podcast off and decide you're never going to buy the book, the Romanians do get a fancy new tank hunter squad, don't they? And that's pretty tasty.
Yeah, and I think people hear tank hunter and they're thinking anti-tank grenades, and they're like, oh, they're just gonna get mowed down by the whole mountain machine gun, and that'll be that. Yeah, so doing research into the Romanians, I found a really interesting kind of it was kind of almost an official doctrine that they used is basically the command squad of a platoon would designate kind of their 2 toughest, most capable men to basically form this 2-man anti-tank hunter team. And they're armed to the teeth. I mean, they got smoke grenades, they got anti-tank grenades, they got submachine guns. So I've written special rules for them. They're not just your kind of bog standard men with anti-tank grenades. They have the capability to do some damage, and not just against tanks. So I thought this was a really unique unit that deserved to have its own entry, and something that I didn't see anywhere else in terms of the other combatants. So I wanted to, make sure that they got some recognition, got their place on the table. I can see a lot of uses for this unit as being kind of a small but capable force to, first of all, give you an order dice, but also to almost kind of working as similar to the Japanese suicide anti-tank guy of being a almost area denial unit, right?
Yeah, they're very similar to the Soviet ones, and I can see, I think they're going to get included in nearly every Romanian army because they're nice and cheap, so they're another order dice for not too much, but they're enough of a threat that your opponent can't just ignore them. And I genuinely think this is going to be one of those auto-includes for a lot of Romanian players.
Well, and I think they'll be fun to model too, because they're not just a man with rifle, right? They're veterans. They're loaded up with equipment, and so if you're kit bashing a soldier, I can see the Winter German sprue from Warlord being a good kit bashing, inclusion here where they a lot of them have carrying like anti-tank mines or other equipment, right? So,
Mm.
convert a couple guys, load them up to the gills with the explosives, and you have a cool little unit that looks nice on the battlefield, right?
Yeah. The other one that I think will be great for the same reason is the Cossack squad. Especially now, sort of, it's been widened to, I think, Soviets, Italians, and the Germans can take them. And I think they're going to be a great modeling opportunity for people to model up some Cossacks, and they are decent as well.
Yeah, the Cossacks were fun to do research into because they're very much just their own thing. They're refusing to kind of integrate into whoever is employing them. So when they're in German service, they're in German service, but they're still Cossacks. There's no denying that. And same with the Soviets, same with the Italians. So you get some I think I think they're going to be a popular unit to put on the tabletop. And depending on
Mm.
how generic you go with their uniforms, you might be able to reuse the same unit in multiple armies. There's a lot of cavalry in this book. So if you like
Yeah,
horses, do you like painting horses? Buy campaign case blue. You can
absolutely.
also you can also have the Cossacks dismounted as well, which
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean you can do, but let's be honest, the Cossacks are kind of known for being on horseback. But yeah, those were fun to
Mm.
include, and I went out and got some Cossacks myself because I was like, okay, well, I can't write this book and not have my own Cossacks, so
Oh,
they're
yeah.
on my to-do list coming up soon.
Yeah, I think I'll be getting some for my German army as well. Definitely.
The other big thing, Alex, that you get in this book, not just new units, is a new nation. We've
Mm.
now got armies of Slovakia. So, do you want to talk the listeners through what they can expect from the Slovakian list?
Yeah, sure. The inclusion of the Slovakians was kind of a not something I had planned at all when I began the book.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, However, as I did my research, the Slovak Mobile division would pop up here and there in the histories, and I became curious, like what were they doing there? What was their composition? How did they fight? And it just so happens that I was able to get in touch with someone who had done a ton of research on Slovak troops in World War II for bolt action specifically. Uh, his family traces from the region, and he had
Hmm.
wanted to build a Slovak force for bolt action, and he had basically made his own army list. This is Michael, and I give him most of the credit for inspiring me for this in the book. And so he basically handed me a ready-made unit list. So here's everything they had in the mobile division. Here's everything they had in the war. Here's what their trucks could do. And so that made things extremely easy. He gave me here's all my sources. Here's all this translated. Um, and so, with all that information at my fingertips, I was like, well, it would be irresponsible for me not to include this, since
Mm-hmm.
someone has clearly put in so much time and effort into doing all this research. So I was like, okay, well, let's look into it, and I found them to be interesting. I don't know if I would create my own Slovak army. I guess I will at some point if I'm going to do all of the armies. Um, but I like them as I do like underdog forces, and they're definitely an underdog force. This single division caught in this massive Eastern Front, and they do have some unique units and some unique rules. As I think so, maybe people who like to go with the kind of obscure niche forces will find some inspiration there, and
Hmm.
we'll start seeing some Slovaks here and there.
Mm. They get the 88, which is a great addition for them, isn't it, in terms of the artillery side of things?
They also have a very nice armored car. They have a few of the kind of Czechoslovakian tanks,
Hmm.
and they're kind of I wouldn't put them as like necessarily like a premier tier force, but I think they're
Hmm.
kind of I tried to bring them to the same line. I kind of see there's maybe different tiers of nations so far in bolt
Hmm.
action. We have the majors and
Yeah.
then the minors. I've tried to bring the minors kind of closer up to where the major factions are to make them more not necessarily viable, but more a little bit more balanced or more on this in the same kind of gives you the same feel of playing them, right? It is a bit
Yeah.
of a bummer bring out your Hungarians and know that you really only have one special army rule that's going to be in play, right?
Yeah, sure.
So giving people something to play with and give them some unique feeling to their army. And I've tried to do that with the Slovaks as well.
Yeah,
Hmm.
their national characteristics are, as you say, they're not the top tier national characteristics, overpowered, ban them from tournaments level, but equally they're not useless. They've some really interesting national characteristics they've got that I think if you build your force around them, they're certainly like sufficiently competitive force that I don't think you'll be disappointed if you turn up to the club with them and you come up against, I don't know, US or something. I think you're in for a fair fight there.
Hmm.
My only question with them from a design point, and a bugbear that I think a lot of people in the community have with the Maya Nations, I say that, that's my opinion. So I'm just assigning that to loads of people as though
As the spokesman for the bolt action community.
as a spokesman for my own opinion, I always find it minorly annoying that the minor nations trucks never have machine guns on them. And I just wanted to take this opportunity while I've got you here to ask sort of the design philosophy behind that, because I noticed the Slovaks have a similar situation there.
Well, yeah, as the spokesman for all bolt action authors, let me I mean, I can only speak from my personal experience.
Hmm.
Essentially, what it comes down to, at least for me, are two things: my time availability and my kind of interests and or experience. So, what do I
Yeah,
mean by that? Time. Okay, so I got this book to write. I have 1 year to get it done. That involves reading 30 or 40 books and sources,
Mm.
writing it all, doing all the research, play testing it, right? And so I being selective of what is and isn't included is sometimes part of that, right? Having to
yeah,
make decisions of what to leave out. And then in terms of my expert or interest and knowledge, I'm not a truck guy. I'm not a vehicle
yeah,
person. You'll notice that the units I've added for most of these my two books are infantry units or otherwise.
Yes. Yeah, yeah.
mm,
It's because I'm not super well necessarily well versed, but I'm not the kind of guy who's doing research into what kind of truck the Romanians had in those winter of 1942. It's for me it's I don't know. A truck is a truck, I
yeah,
guess. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
um so for me, it's something I don't even really think about that much. I can't speak for other authors, but I suspect there's a similar thing going on where in terms of like, okay, I got to add some new units. How much time do I have to do this? What do I focus on? Is it trucks? Probably not. What I would like to see, and I think a lot of other people probably agree with me, is the new books for the miners, right?
yeah.
And that's the place where those things can be addressed. Obviously the Slovaks didn't exist before. Did they have machine guns mounted on their trucks? I didn't find anything that said so, but that doesn't mean that didn't happen. And
Yeah.
it's something that I didn't really focus on. So, for those of you that are passionate about your truck mounted machine guns, you have my deepest condolences.
Yeah, it sounds like because sort of my philosophy as because I'm more sort of on the gamer side, I enjoy it as a game, and I'm quite happy to sort of allow a bit of blurriness around the edges of historical accuracy. But obviously, where that line is different for different people, and it sounds like your philosophy was very much that you are only including things if you had sort of a historical record of them existing, because that was a similar thing with the Romanian anti-tank rifles, wasn't it? So I guess that makes sense if you didn't find a record for it happening, then it makes sense not to put it in.
Well, and
Mm.
it's kind of the safer way to do it, right? So
Yeah,
if you sit, if you let a unit, let's say allow the Germans to take a Panther at a battle that was before the Panther was in service in that front, right? That you've basically introduced a huge ahistorical hole, right, in your book or
yeah,
a imbalance, right? Now, if you don't include the Panther and maybe they were available, does that create such a huge imbalance? Maybe not, because you can always say, well, maybe the Panthers weren't at this particular point at this particular moment, right? So it's always kind of safer to not allow something than to allow something. And if you can't find a record that it exists, then you know I mean, if you look at okay, I looked at 100 pictures of Slovakian trucks. I didn't see any mounted with machine guns. Does that mean that none of them had machine guns? No, but the probably most of them did not.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
is it
Yeah.
safer to not allow that? You know what I mean? So for me as a kind of with my training, I kind of in terms of being a history major and a history teacher, I kind of look
Hmm.
for can I justify this with sources first? And if I can't, then I tend not to allow something. That being
Yeah.
said, I mean the individual scenarios are a moment in time and a moment in place, but you're not it's not a historical reenaction of that actual event, right? We're not using real orders of battle. So I do try to, in the scenarios, give people flexibility because not everyone has the exact forces that would be at this particular battle, right? Oh, I don't have, 5 medium machine guns for this scenario. Well, that doesn't mean I can, so I can't play it. Well, what do you have, and what would plausibly be in the area that could have fought in this battle and not allow that, right? So, yeah, I kind of have, I guess, I don't know if it's contradictory or not, but for terms of scenarios, I tend to be a little loose in terms of what
Hmm.
forces were in the vicinity, those could plausibly
Hmm.
be there, allow all that. But in terms of adding new units, I don't want to be the guy who adds something that I can't back up historically.
Hmm.
I see it more as kind of warlords' prerogative to balance the kind of nations. Although I can't
Yeah.
put Slovakia on them because that was all me. So I'll take the blame for that one. But in terms of like things like the Romanians, Hungarians, I see questions like why isn't this vehicle included?
Mm.
And it was because it didn't come up in my research. It was really the
Hmm.
answer.
Hmm.
Then again, I wasn't particularly looking at what trucks people were driving.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
it's a tricky thing, concluding what people and what I want out of a Hungarian army might not be what someone else wants, right? If I'm building an all infantry
Absolutely.
force, I'm looking at this, this, and this. Someone else is building a mechanized or mobile force. They might be looking at something completely different, right? So, um, my kind of emphasis was on the infantry and kind of cavalry forces that most of these nations had, not necessarily their kind of mechanical. Because I see that the I don't know the transports as being kind of not as exciting. I don't know as
Yeah.
some of the other units. Let's be honest, but I know
Yeah,
some
yeah,
people are passionate about it, and that's cool too. So hopefully the minor nations will get their due and their logistical areas.
yeah.
Unfortunately, I maybe not the right person for that, but I'm sure there's someone out there who has all that knowledge who can maybe one day, um, add that to their roster.
Yeah, yeah. I think respectfully, Johnny, the reason why you're asking is because you don't want a transport that can't fire, because then it's a pointless order dice. Once it's done, it's transporting.
Yeah, partly that. It's also just from a game balance perspective. So you get
True.
the.
Yeah,
It's always sort of when I'm thinking of it as a game, I'm always thinking, well, if X gets it, then Y should probably get it, unless it sort of like is a unique feature of that force. And as I
yeah, yeah,
say, it's always one where I think, well, someone must have jerry rigged it at some point. But equally, if there's no historical record for it and it is a historical game, I can see the argument the other way that why should we put
sure.
something in just to balance the game out?
Yeah, yeah. It's a really good point, Alex. That when you're writing from a campaign book perspective, obviously you're looking at the history, the research. Can you justify it? The bigger questions about balancing the nations very much does need to fall on Warlord's shoulders rather than the author of a particular book who's introducing a number of new units to that nation.
Yeah, and we can do a little bit in terms of kind of balancing, like if you add a very powerful unit that can be taken in lots of selectors and lots of in the generic
Hmm.
selectors, that does rebalance the force to a certain extent, right? I think
Mm.
we've seen that in some of the recent campaign books where forces, armies get this really nice shiny unit that is going to start appearing
Hmm.
everywhere, and that does, that does affect the balance.
Hmm.
But in the end, we're working at a very micro level, and Warlord's looking at it from a macro level. And
Yes.
so
Yeah. Yeah.
the overall balance, I think, is something that is hard for the individual writers to see. Like for instance, like I said, I don't even know what the other writers of the campaign books are working on, right? Or what Warlord is working on. So where my piece fits in, I have kind of a limited perspective of how that affects everything else. I do totally understand that from a balance perspective, giving people equal abilities. I mean, I'm kind of the opinion that transports are kind of overcosted as they are.
Hmm.
I would probably, if I were in charge of Bolt Action 3.0, I might reduce some of the costs of some of those, and so that you don't feel that sting if they don't stick around. Let's be honest, not a lot of trucks are sticking around to fire machine guns in the middle of battle.
No, exactly. Yeah.
So
yeah.
if they drop off their troops and then disappear, and if they're 10 points, is that worth it to you or not? If they don't stick around and actually contribute to causing any casualties, I think that's a little bit easier to swallow than if they are more expensive, especially things like half tracks, right? Which are very expensive. And you want them to stick around and do fighting, because otherwise you're wasting so many points. So I think that's kind of a overall balance thing that I would like to see maybe version 3.0 get some love there.
Yeah, I could see that if you made the base transport sort of 5 points cheaper, but then the version with the machine gun 5 points more. Because I think you're right. I think an empty transport is quite an expensive unit that doesn't do a huge amount after it's dropped the troops off. But equally, with a machine gun, I think they're actually really well costed in terms of the game perspective. And so I suppose you could drop the base cost, but increase the machine gun cost, which would be quite cool to see.
I was going to say, it's a whole other episode, isn't it? In terms of tweaking points here and there and how it ripples into something else.
Yeah. Just the usual.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's been really interesting talking through the book, talking about the process of writing the book, as well as sort of highlighting those interesting units that are unique to this front. So again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for taking this time to talk to us and tell us all about it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen, for having me on. I'm always happy to talk about bolt action, and I look forward to hearing what you guys think about the book, and as you do your deep dive into the various units and its foibles and of the balance and how it all fits together. So I'm sure you guys will have some great content coming up regarding this and some of the other Warlord releases. So I look forward to hearing that. And it's been a pleasure talking to you both. Have an awesome day.
No, thanks, Alex, for joining us. It's been really, really interesting to talk about the whole process of what it is to write a book. Like you said, nearer the time when we get to the point when the book's released, we will actually talk about the units in more detail. But for the time being, we're holding back so as not to give too much away between now and release date.
Thank you for listening. Ta-ta for now.
Ta-ta for now.